Melissa Jackson's entry into the church. Melissa Jackson was raised in a deeply religious family. From an early age, she attended New Life Baptist Church, where she was educated in the traditions and practices of the Christian faith. The church was a place of safety, where she always felt part of a welcoming and respectful community. When she was offered the opportunity to start working as an administrative assistant at the church at the age of 23, she was thrilled to accept the offer. After all, working with such an admired leader as Pastor Jerome Mitchel seemed like the perfect career move for her. Jerome Mitchel was a charismatic man with an imposing presence that easily captivated the congregation. His sermons were known for their eloquence and their power to mobilize people's faith. When Melissa first began working with him, she saw him as a role model, a model of virtue and godliness. However, as time went on, she began to realize that the image she had of the pastor was about to be shattered. In the first few months of her job, everything seemed to be going well. Melissa was dedicated and gradually gained Jerome's trust. However, she soon began to notice subtle signs that something was wrong. He would often make comments about her appearance more than necessary. At first, she tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was just a compliment. But soon, the pastor's behavior became more invasive. He began calling Melissa into private meetings and making insinuations about how important her presence was to the success of the church. But what initially seemed like genuine concern soon turned into something much more manipulative and uncomfortable. Part 2: Psychological Abuse and Manipulation. As time went on, Jerome's behavior became increasingly controlling and disconcerting. He began to make more aggressive advances and suggest that a personal relationship between them could help Melissa advance within the church. He used his leadership position to coerce Melissa, who felt emotionally and psychologically trapped. She didn't know how to escape this situation without jeopardizing her reputation and that of her family. Melissa, confused and fearful, began to feel increasingly isolated. Conversations she would have with co-workers or friends outside of church became strained because she couldn't share what was happening with anyone. Jerome had a way of making his actions seem normal, and she began to wonder if she was really overreacting. She worried that if she spoke up about what was happening, she would be discredited or even kicked out of the church, which would mean losing the only support structure she had ever known. When Jerome began to physically pressure her, with inappropriate touching during meetings or even at church activities, Melissa felt as if she was losing control of the situation. She tried to push him away with forced smiles and vague apologies, but with each encounter, he became more insistent. One day, during a private meeting, he abruptly hugged her and tried to kiss her, leaving her feeling completely helpless. It was at that moment that Melissa knew she had to take action, but she didn't know how. Part 3: Gathering Evidence and Preparing for Revenge. Melissa began documenting every encounter with Jerome, saving text messages, recording conversations, and even taking photos of compromising moments. She knew she needed concrete evidence to confront him, or at least to ensure she had something to incriminate him if necessary. The decision to do so was not made impulsively. Melissa found herself forced to become an observer of her own suffering, as if she were distancing herself from her own body in order to endure the situation. She became much more careful in her interactions with Jerome, making him believe that his words and actions were working. Melissa felt a certain disgust for herself, but she was determined. She could no longer let Jerome manipulate her life without putting an end to it. She began to discreetly record their conversations, hoping that one day, this evidence might be the key to unmasking him. Jerome, on the other hand, seemed increasingly confident that he was getting what he wanted. He showed no signs of guilt and saw himself as a man of unquestionable power. In that moment, Melissa realized how manipulated she had been and how he used his position of authority to destroy lives without any consequences. As evidence gathered, she finally felt that she could regain some control over her own life. But at the same time, the weight of her actions began to accumulate, and the line between justice and revenge became increasingly blurred. Melissa knew that her path was about to change forever. She could no longer remain a silent victim, and she knew that by exposing Jerome, the pain of many other women could be alleviated. But she also knew that by doing so, she would also destroy a man's life, and perhaps her own. It was a devastating internal struggle, but she continued her plan, fueled by anger, pain, and the need to expose the truth. Part 4. Jerome's unraveling. Jerome's health began to deteriorate during the summer of 2021. He began to miss services, events, and important meetings. His once constant and imposing presence at church activities was gradually replaced by an absence that no one could ignore. But the reason behind his failing health was not just stress or burnout, there was something deeper and darker going on. Melissa had known about Jerome's condition from the beginning, but she never imagined that he would be so reckless as to put her at risk of serious illness. The HIV-positive diagnosis came when Jerome finally sought medical help. When his wife Diane began noticing her husband's erratic behavior and frequent absences, she investigated further and found a wealth of compromising evidence on Jerome's cell phone, including a text message from Melissa. The message was simple but to the point: "Thank you for tonight." Diane immediately hired a private investigator to investigate further, and soon evidence of Jerome's affair with Melissa began to emerge. The detective uncovered not only the affair, but also the fact that Jerome had been negligent about his health status. He knew he was HIV positive, but he had no regard for protecting the people he was involved with. Melissa was one of the unwitting victims of his irresponsible behavior. In a fit of rage and despair, Diane confronted Jerome in his hospital bed. He, weakened by his illness, finally admitted to the affair with Melissa, but insisted that he had no idea that he was putting others at risk. Diane, devastated by the betrayal and the threat to her own health, immediately took steps to sue Jerome, while also beginning to plan their separation.